So what I would like to do, and Maristella as well, actually, for being always aware of what happens in the world, I'm going to literally what I would call this presentation a draft of a presentation. I put it together fairly quickly, but thoughtfully. In other words, trying to understand retroactively what we were trying to do when we put together the so-called paperless studio. The name has always been ironical because, of course, we've never produced as much paper as with now with printers and computers. So what I wanted to do, and as you can see on the title, "The Making of a Generation" and how it came about, it's half the story of a school and half my own story, in a sense. Namely, when I started at Columbia, I had two ambitions. One, which was, or maybe one main one, and the second one was attached to it as a facilitator. The main one was to try to make out of this school, which had been left behind, to make it the locus or the focus of a new generation of architects. I had been lucky enough to be at BA in the 70s, at a time when people as diverse as Graham Koolhaas, Leon Krier, and Libeskind, and a few others, and Zaha and Nigel Coates, were all there either as faculty members or as students, and were able to sharpen their own identity in relationship to one another, and the very fact that these people were actually quite different from one another. So arriving in New York, at Columbia rather, I had been in New York already for 12 years. Arriving at Columbia in '88, I wanted to try to generate the next generation. The university is conservative, it has tenured faculty members, but you can go around this by hiring young kids between the age of 28 and 32, and in a way try to give them the means of developing their own discourse. So that was the first ambition, but the second one had to do with how do you express yourself, knowing that the expression of an architect is generally also related to how they think. And just to, I apologize for the cliche sort of examples that I'm going to give you. We all know, my various spots, I'll come back to that. The first introduction about perspective isometrics. You all know the argument that has been made often enough that the way the Renaissance thought was, and the Renaissance architecture was very much related to the mode of representation that can be invented. And similarly, in the 19th century, when Choisy invents a certain form of isometric, that has also an effect on the way architects will think about architecture. So in this sense, the relationship between the mode of notation and the way of thinking is fundamental to architecture. I could say that in my own teaching and in my own work, I had been trying to do the same thing, whereby rather than looking at some of the, of course, a good example of the, let's say, not the catalogue of received ideas, but rather what was generally understood as what architecture is. In other words, according to certain models, here, of course, the Maison de Minot. I tried to find, this was in the 70s, to find other modes of notation, for example, looking at text, instead of looking at a program with square meters and rooms, rather giving students an excerpt from a text by Edgar Allan Poe or by Calvino or by, in this particular case, James Joyce, and then even doing those projects sometimes myself, in order to develop a language that could be not necessarily original, but that would have its own identity in relationship to the time we lived in. I was fascinated by some modes of notations that were used by other disciplines. Namely, in this particular case, the famous score for Alexander Nevsky by Sergei Eisenstein, the Russian avant-garde filmmaker, where he combines information about the shots, about the musical score by Prokofiev, the camera angles, the movement of the protagonist, and so on. I, in a sense, was strongly indebted to it when I tried to do the architectural equivalent of this, whereby distinguishing on one hand what happens in a space, in other words the program, the spaces themselves, section elevation, section plan, and the movement of bodies in that space. In other words, introducing the idea of time and the idea of movement in architectural notation, which is normally not done in most plans and sections of architects. So, taking pieces taken from various films, started to notate the choreography of the movements of bodies in space, transform them, solidifying them in terms of walls, turning the negative and making it into the space of the fight in a 1932 film, Frankenstein, and then developing this idea of a tripartite notation which would have the program, the space, and the movement. Space, event, movement, SEM, SEM, as a form of meaning that architecture would develop based on a different mode of notation. That led to the Manhattan transcript, which was about combining these three space, event, movements in such a way that they would prove to be completely interchangeable, that there would not be a hierarchy between them, that one would not be more important than the other, that it would be literally a sort of intertextuality of program, space, and movement, and then finding various manipulation where superimposition was one of the major factors, and then editing, cutting out, and so on. All this was drawn by hand. It was, in the late 70s, in a way which I always felt one could have multiplied to infinity had one had, those instruments like computers that came a little later. So that's, in a sense, where I was coming from, the axonometric being a symbol also of the modern movement, but when I started to work on the notion of the exploded axonometric, that is the one that makes that distinction between space, event, and movement, was indeed trying to develop that language that would give that identity either to my own work or to other people of my, let's say, own generation, including things which were for the fun of it, like notation for fireworks, based on certain music notation that eventually became ways to develop architectural designs and projects here for the Tokyo Opera, where the music notation becomes the starting point of the organization of the building itself, and literally the mode of thinking about the language itself, in French, l'écriture, the writing of it, becomes the let's put it this way, becomes the beginning of a concept. So that's, if you want, that's where I come from. But if we were trying at Columbia in 1988 to find what that new generation would do, and that's the time where I hired people like Hani Rashid, who you saw this morning and yesterday, Greg Lynn and Jesse Reiser, and a few others. The idea was that we would make it possible for them to develop their own language, but at that time, not really knowing how that would express itself. In 1992, I was already using computers, but not at all in the creative way that these guys would use later, but much more based on the idea of layers, namely saying that if you have programs that talk about the layering, maybe we could do it in construction terms, and each layers, in the same way as in the Manhattan transcript, you had the layers of space, event, and movement. Here you would now have layers of material, the layer of concrete, the layer of glass, the layer of steel, etc. In other words, taking some of the characteristics of the computer language, of the software, in order to give an interpretation of architecture itself. But, so at that time, in 1992-93, I started to talk to the university to try to get the funding to bring computers into the school in such a way that we could literally find how one can think with the computers. Very briefly, just for the anecdote, we prepared a very sort of solid document asking for $1 million. The university looked at it, had us present it in front of experts and all that, and 2 weeks or 4 weeks later came back to us and he said, "Oh, that is well, but it's not enough. You want 1.5 million." That they made available to us. So within a few months, now we're talking in summer '94, we had all the equipment, or part of it. And what I want to show you is the effect that it had in the school in a period of 5-6 years. So first I'm going to show you some images of work done by the faculty here in the summer of '92, Hani with his installations. Here, Stan Allen. This is not a computer drawing, this is a model. Good photograph. This is Will Eretz. It's also interesting to see these names. Hani, Stan, Will Eretz were people that I brought in to try to circumvent the system that had very intelligent people. There's no question that Bob Stern and Frampton were key members of the faculty, but they were not necessarily the ones who would be the inventor of a new language. So, Eretz here, one of his students, with using film and photographs. Hani again with other installations. We are now spring '93. Again, he used photographic devices and model and inversions. Very little computer works, all coming from unexpected corners. Amy Anderson with wireframe drawings, or Zaha with Patrick Schumacher. No computers here. We are still before we are at that time, a few months or before. Their models, but look already what the language is, right? It's not quite the language of your standard architectural work. You have to remember that from the end of the 80s onward, well, throughout the 80s, There was something called postmodernism. Of course, there had been the show at MoMA with deconstructivism, but at the same time, the work was developing in direction which were not necessarily uninteresting. Look at what Lynn does. There's no computer here, it's 93. Already there is something which is the beginning of a new language, of a new sensibility. Again, Hani with his use of media and of light, Jesse Reiser, again, the computers are not necessarily yet on the horizon, but the sensibility is here. Stan Allen again, Schuren Cotton, that's here left quite behind. Greg Lynn with models which are made of cardboard. Hani again with other installation. And Greg Lynn starts in the spring of '94 with some of the work, as you have seen next door to here, start to understand that there is somewhere an incredible and vast horizon in front of him. Jesse Reiser, by the way, this is not a computer drawing, this is a model made of cardboard. We are spring '94, and Ben Van Werkel, again at the time I had tried to get that generation, the cast of characters you have seen as far as the American crowd. The other group of people who was quite interesting and quite creative came mostly from Holland, with Ben Van Werkel, Wil Erets, and later people like the Knox group and so on. So that summer we start to we have the machines, we start to put together a group of people who are going to be the first one who are going to experiment with the computer studios, the paperless studios. The first 3 or 4 are Stan Allen, Keller Esterling, Greg Lynn, and Scott Marble. Fascinating. Within, I'll show you a couple of images, you know, the mood there, and all the computers were on the attic of Avery Hall at Columbia. Quite fascinating was the fact that when you walked into this room, within a few weeks, just looking at the screens, without knowing who the faculty member was, you were able to immediately identify which one had been done by Greg Lynn, which one by Stan Allen, which one by Hani, and which one by Scott Marble. In reverse order, one used simple fly-through, another one used datascapes. Hani used a lot of collage, very much using Photoshop in a sort of crypto-surrealist manner. And Greg Lynn was already experimenting with models coming from other fields, namely fluid mechanics and so on. There was no unified software available. People were to improvise. So Scott Marble and his fly-throughs, Greg Lynn again, Stan Allen testing things. You will notice that very often the names have a width, because those faculty members, including myself, didn't know how to use the computers. So we had to have a DA. A DA was not a TA. A DA was a digital assistant. In other words, the young, smart kid who knew how to use the thing. So the work was very much testing without a plan. In other words, without really knowing what one could do with it. And it was quite interesting because immediately those, that identification of the work in relationship to past concerns and investigation of the individual concerned was quite visible. Hani again with his installations, Jesse Reiser, amusingly enough, here it's just at the cusp between the computer and the model, Stan Allen again, and so on. And so what you see as I move along is that during that first year, it was very much a sort of, how could I describe it, a fairly experimental group, but then everybody wanted to join in. People who you never would have thought with these watercolors would start to investigate with the computer. Greg Lynn again with Ed Keller, Scott Marble again, and so little by little, but actually with an incredible speed, it all happens within, again, 3 to 5 years, the language in the school completely changes. But as I said, not radically, it simply accelerates things that were already in the works. The analogy that I could make is the analogy of the elevator in the 19th century. All architects had designed towers before that and built some. But the invention of the elevator accelerated the making of towers, and Manhattan exists and so on. In the same way, the arrival of the computer accelerates a number of things for that particular generation. And here the thing works, namely that generation has its own language, just as the previous ones had one. And so we can continue about what is interesting. Yeah, that's again the second. So I really taught at Columbia because I was trying to constantly juggle between my own architectural practice and the deanship, but at the same time I felt absolutely indispensable to understand what was the relationship between computers and architectural education. Not that I got a definite answer at the end of that time, and I probably still don't have it. But the work has changed and immediately starts to have an incredible effect on the architectural culture around us. Now, historically, as we know, it is what happened in architectural offices, in the profession, so to speak, that influenced what was being taught in the schools. At that moment, it goes the other way around. It is what is happening in the schools that start to have an influence on what happens in the architectural offices. So I'm not talking about the 4 that are, in the exhibition. Those had started to look at it long before. I'm talking about the architectural profession in general. So the work starts to have indeed an identity, but not necessarily a focus. And that's perhaps the question that I would, be happy to raise with you in our discussion, is to which extent the computer enabled architecture to develop new concepts, or whether it has simply allowed an internal logic to the mode of notation that the computer was facilitating without necessarily finding a new conceptual approach. That's the question. Of course, I'm not talking about all the schlock which is done in hyper-realist renderings called iconic architecture or iconism. I'm talking about more these works that you see on the screen, which is actually intelligent, serious, but at the same time, to which extent was it renewing in architectural concepts way of thinking? So of course, let me go a little faster. The reason why I'm questioning that is now, as an architect myself, just for the anecdote, I'll show you posters of the time. Lars Spurgerock Wolf-Briggs, Novak, Colentin, Piano, of course Bernard Cash. In other words, you see that in that list taken almost not at random in those 2 years, half of these people at least will be people who will become identified, take Zahra Polo-Musavi, will be identified with what they did with the new tools. People a little younger then, including myself, Jeffrey, and so on. So the reason why I raised the question is that I asked myself whether what one calls either the diagram or the conceptual sort of sketch is not something that the computer cannot do. Namely, there is a question of speed and a question of transformation. These diagrams, which are fundamental to architectural concept thinking, are inevitably too quick to be done with the computer. So what does it mean today in terms of the serious research? And I would call serious research the work of, again, the 4 people who are in the room next door, and in reality I would rather look more in depth to that younger generation, in other words, the Jesse, the Greg, the Hani, and so on. To which extent does it allow us to say that the tool that we use is more than a formal device that has a fantastic ability to be translated in construction terms, but does it necessarily allow us to renew the conceptual thinking of what architecture is, i.e. what is the definition of architecture today in the digital age? What is architecture? Thank you.
It's just a proposal that tradition may not have fostered yet clear new concept, but it hasn't settled a lot of traditional things we believe in architecture, which would be actually going deeper than the tool itself. And it has made scale has become problematic. In some ways, the relation to structure is something complicated. Now we're blurring between structure and elements. That a lot of distinction we used to take as granted, a lot of fundamentals of architecture have been challenged. And we're in that stage.
You're absolutely correct that fundamentals of architecture have been challenged. We see it in the exhibition next door. For example, the idea of the plane, the vertical plane and the horizontal plane, the facade and the roof, has been completely, pushed out of the way. You remember, 50 years ago, Buckminster Fuller was not considered an architect. Today, we think wonderful envelopes. In other words, the word envelope replaces the word facade, roof, and so on. There's no more cornices, there's more articulation of this sort. Now, interestingly enough, the work of envelopes starts, take a look at Frank next door. He plays with blankets before he knows how to use, the computer. So that's why I'm saying that with the demonstration with Colombia, the mode of thinking changes at the same time as the new technology arrives. Now, the reason why I asked I put the question in conceptual terms is, say, in comparison to other disciplines. When psychoanalysis defines itself, it says it has 4 fundamental concepts. One of them being transfer, another one being the unconscious. It cannot exist without those concepts. What are the fundamental concepts of architecture? and how are they changed through the computer, or is there one single concept which is now, since, you know, absolutely has changed what architecture is, right? That's the question that I'm trying to raise. And what you just said, I think you're probably correct. And I think Hani said something similar this morning. We are still in the transition period, and we are not yet into, you know, the new age.
I'm just thinking of the parallel in photography. Remember the Museum of Art did an exhibition called Before Photography. It was their extraordinary work that's been done in Denmark by painters that were, you know, really looking at reflection and the whole thing. And after it changed painting.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And I think you could say that it applies to a number of areas. Literature, the way to write a novel changed with the arrival of cinema. You know, you don't write a novel the same way anymore.
Go ahead. How does the role of diagram change, particularly now? So if you left us with the question of what is digital architecture, what is architecture today, then what is the role of the diagram?
The word diagram is very ambiguous. Architects have used diagrams forever, right? It has also sometimes changed, had different connotations, you know, and it was called a party. There is certainly something that exists between a thought and a plan. There is a mediation, there is an intermediary. And that intermediary is what I would call the diagram. That's what I was showing you, you know, at the end. Hani made a remark this morning, which I thought was quite fascinating. When laughingly, he gave the example of his student as the Amdevantante who had no idea what a plan was, right? You mean a view from above, right? I sometimes ask myself, looking at what some architects, you know, involved with research in the field, I'm asking myself, do they know what the concept is? In other words, they develop a mechanical process that does not necessarily lead to, in my view, lead to another thought process, right? And so the discussion on diagrams that took place a few years ago was, to me, extremely fertile and very, you know, very correct. But it was simply describing the evolution of processes. And in a way, if I take Peter Eisenman, I remember in the 70s, in 76 or 77, I had been asked by Art Forum to do a series on architecture. And I invited a few architects to do a specific piece of work, you know, for it. So John Hayden did absolutely wonderful drawings that was so fine. The color was so subtle that the printer had a hard time printing them. Raymond Abraham gave me a slide which was so dirty that it had to be cleaned through incredible sort of technical means. And Peter, as usual, said, well, you do whatever you want. So I started to take each of the houses, whatever 11 houses, and place them in sequence of transformations. And it was interesting, the notion of transformation was totally one that preceded the computer transformation, but were absolutely part of Peter's thinking. Right? So, in other words, every time there was an identifiable, how can I say, mode of thought. And so my question now, what is the mode of thinking that will characterize what, architecture is becoming? And again, it's got nothing to do with the current era, which one of the points that I made, talking about 94, 93, 94, 95, is that there were no unified thinking, there were no homogeneous approach, there were no softwares that could do everything. Today, if you look at architectural competitions, we all do the same stuff, including myself. We use the same softwares, we have the same renders, they use the same techniques. Again, we cannot distinguish whether the building has been built or not built because the client asks you for so-called hyper-realist rendering. This calls for a particular sensibility, hence the icon. This is not necessarily that the architects want to do them. They are part of a commercial production, which has very little to do with the discussion you initiated with the archaeology of the digital. Right? So my question is simply, again, where are we going? And knowing that over a period of 3,000 years, the definition of architecture has changed quite radically. What is going to be the definition of architecture in the digital age? And if I had the answer, I would give it to you. What I had is perhaps some areas, perhaps I know the question to ask, but not necessarily the answers that go with it.
I have one question about this notion that the values of architecture changed. That is very fascinating. So it's not a fixed eternal block of values. So they seem to have changed as a response to technical transformation, social, critical. So in the digital era now, do you think it's more computer as a tool of design? So it is changing because computer is like perspective. It will be more because of a technical way of building. So it's true that we do not have the answer collectively, but there might be some hints of how the digital might create its response to architecture.
I'm not too interested in the digital, the computer as a tool of design. I'm far more interested in how it affects the way we think. Let me just go back not so far, perhaps a long time ago for most of you in the audience, but not so long ago. In the mid-70s, you had two very important persons, one in America, the other one in Europe, called, Robert Venturi and Aldo Rossi. Both of them, in very different ways, advocated a return to some eternal values of architecture, what they called constants, especially with Rossi, where it says there are certain invariant things that never vary. They will be always there. The discourse on autonomy is also fed by that, but on that notion of certain fixed values that never change. Things have changed quite radically since. So that's why I will say that the architecture is a fantastic area of endeavor because it has an enormous future in front of itself. Right? I do not know if Hani showed you one thing that he did, probably in 94, 95 at Columbia, where he through a net, through Wood Auditorium, that's the large auditorium, we have about 300 seats, and then by light games projected but generated through digital means, was able to change the perception of the space itself and its dimensions, simply playing on that strange relation between the virtual and the real. And that's, you know, that's an interesting notion. What is real, what is, you know, exactly a week ago I went to see again with my son Palladio Villas, you know, the usual 7 or 8 that one goes and visit. And I was fascinated that many of them are quite clumsy. There's always a detail that doesn't work. The villa, the rotonda, the ceiling that doesn't connect correctly with the roof. However, in the drawing that he did after building the villa, he appears to have worked it out. And if you look very seriously, no, he hasn't worked it out, but in the drawing it looks damn good. So I'm talking about the same phenomena with the, you know, with the computer. Modes of notations have an enormous, you know, role in the way we think. And the new mode of notation, is no question about that, is, you know, is digital.
Another question, which would be the following: if really, you know, totally sympathetic, because I believe really the same with the computer is really interesting as a kind of epistemic dimension. But then, shouldn't we to really understand what's happening in architecture, replace architecture within the real, the broader realm of culture, art? And if this is the case, you mentioned Eisenstein. What would be the domain to which we should look at in order to understand a bit better what's going on in architecture today?
Yes.
Because the digital is affecting very much all the domains of production. So what would be for you, you know, the key domains outside architecture to look at?
Well, the first thing I'm going to probably paraphrase what you said using other words. Architecture has been sometimes called the knowledge of form, and I always felt it was a form of knowledge, we use an easy inversion. So this form of knowledge is, of course, shifting with all other forms of knowledge in all other, you know, in a number of disciplines. And the question is, at the moment, and that's my own sort of uncomfortable feeling, is that the digital has not yet found a way to assert that form of knowledge, right? In other words, the world around us is entirely dominated by a culture of the image. The reason why I was bringing the question of hyper-realist rendering, if you take any of the diagrams which are in the exhibition next door, and you try to see them on that screen, they are unreadable. However, if you take a hyper-realist image, even half the size or a quarter the size, you can read it. So our culture, which has been so image-dominated, has used the computer not at all as a mode, as a form of knowledge, but a reduction of the knowledge that we have. So we are in a strange situation. In other words, we are having, on one hand, the most extraordinary new device, I don't want to call it today, and at the same time, what are we using it for? Oh,
thank you for the fascinating lecture. One of the things that I was really struck by is whether you guys, or you in particular, had a sense of how influential and how much of an impact what was happening at that time was going to have in the future. But you can turn that into a question, but rather I'd like to go back to what you said, whether the digital has actually allowed for new concepts fundamentals of architecture. And so you already mentioned, for example, the dissolution of the distinction between facade and ceiling, and then we turn into an envelope. And I was wondering whether we can actually point to some specific projects, like in Turkey, for example, Alhamdulillah, the Yokohama terminal being an example, but also, for example, ornament no longer being bi-dimensional application onto the facade, but actually taking over also the spatial organization. One can think of the Prada store, the Herzog in the Walk and the Prada store, or one can also perhaps think of the structural elements no longer being massive, but actually being exploded into minimal entities, and therefore then being able to house functions inside and the papers and covers, and we can think, for example, elevators scenario immediately. So I was wondering whether you would agree that there are certain specific examples that you can point to that help us understand how the digital can actually allow potentially rethinking some of the fundamentals of architecture in terms of project, in terms of how you actually design the basic concepts.
I find your question very interesting, because it has two parts. The first one, and then you shift gears. In the first part, you almost speak like Oosterhuis, right? There is utility, there is solidity, and there is beauty, right? You talk about columns, you talk about the envelope as a decorative ornament, etc., etc. And then in the second part, you introduce sort of how the architecture is used, experienced, how you talk about the elevator, the fact that it links certain things and may change the perception of all the use of spaces. Now, architecture is also about problem. It's very much about problem. Again, back to Palladio, the program is fantastic. The plans are always that piano nobile. You never see the plans below or the attic above. It doesn't matter, right? The movement. You never see the staircases inside the Palladio villa. You see the big staircase in front, and the others are completely hidden in the structure. So, in other words, they are programmatic dimensions that are part of the conceptual, fabric of architecture. And that's where I would be interested to see, for example, architects doing programmatic transformation in the same way they're doing, formal transformations. Or we see it a little bit in structure these days, because indeed you can calculate certain things that you couldn't calculate before, it would take too long and so on. But I find in terms of the effect that it has on our, lifestyles, this little object has substantially more effect on our, everyday life than any new building I've seen built, in the last 20 years.
So I was very interested to see you begin by showing the work of the constellation of people that you gathered at this particular moment prior to the introduction of the computer, so that you could then track the shift and the existence already of what you pointed to as a kind of emerging, possibly digital sensibility. Partly because it makes me think that the way the discussion has been framed for us quite heavily, and is often framed around the introduction of the computer, is about the new problems and difficulties that the computer introduced, and which then became disciplinary tasks to work out. But what you present sort of makes me think that we could frame, it could equally be posed in the opposite direction, that the introduction of the computer made certain things which had been difficult very easy. It foreclosed certain disciplinary problems which all of these people might have been working through in their, formally at least, prior to that. It sort of reminds me of the comment about film, that one of the things which might have been the most damaging to the development of the visual language of film was the introduction of sound technology, right? That it actually foreclosed a certain series of problems. And so I wonder if you would be willing to indulge maybe in the speculation about what might have happened if you had brought together that group of people working on those kinds of problems as a first act, but had not introduced the computer? What might have happened?
I'm going to pursue your analogy with film. Sure, the arrival of sound, then the arrival of color, the different size of screen, and then you have filmmakers like Jean Godard, who says film is dead, he's going to do only television. And then, of course, we know television is dead. It's, I see things on my screen. But it also goes with a transformation of society that goes with it, right? And the point that you were making, certain things are made easier and others are made more difficult. That's perfectly fine, right? That's always like that. But what for? And the question is what are we, is a project that has used the computer at 100% of its capabilities today necessarily more original, more useful, more of a contribution to knowledge than one that doesn't use it. And I tend to feel that if we don't have the formulation of those new concepts, we don't know yet how well we can take advantage of it. It's when I use again the example of the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, is when they are defined, that concept of psychoanalysis makes an enormous jump ahead and then dies in a way, right? But you need those anchoring points. And so in a way, I'm expecting from some of you in this room, in the next 10 years to bring the answer to the question.
But so just to pursue that a little bit, is your argument then that it required at that moment the introduction of the computer to pose that problem of how to define those concepts? Or, I guess
I'm saying simply that and that's why I call it the Lord Annotation, or in this sense, it's also the device, simply has an inevitable effect on our way to think, not to build, to think.
But I'm asking whether you felt it was necessary to introduce the computer at that specific moment as a way of making concrete those sets of problematics in the discipline, or could you project, for example, a future for that set of people without having
I think in this case, yes. Again, for the same reason as I said that the elevator was necessary to develop the contemporary city. There is no contemporary city without the elevator. Just I'll take the person behind me. Yes. Yes.
Okay. So one part of your discussion that you didn't touch was digital fabrication, because I remember at the end of the 90s, beginning of 2000, everyone, when reading architectural literature, there was this discussion that architects were going to be taking over the means of production from builders and contractors. And I remember like Michael Silver, who was teaching at Pratt and Yale, they were doing floor work for concrete buildings and those water jet cutting and all that. And yes, now we have these amazing 3D printers, but architects still have not moved to that realm other than producing models. Do you think that's still a possibility?
Well, I personally think, and now I'm talking as an educator, I think it's fundamental for the architect to understand the processes of fabrication, but he doesn't have, or she doesn't have to be a fabricator themselves. I think there's a naivety in terms of the scale of the work and the complexity. The work of an architect will go far beyond the production of pieces. Right? So, but you have to understand the process, and maybe that was how can I say, an inevitable step.
I'll start with like a funny anecdote. This morning on the way to the metro, I was listening to a pop singer, and she was saying to a ear, once you go tech, you never go back. And I'm wondering in that way if the kind of answer to your question, the kind of first question that Michael was asking about, so how can the computer begin to then reevaluate a new concept or a new movement in that sense? What if the computer is just simply a foil for our current reality in that way? And it goes back to what you were kind of hinting at with the virtual and the real. And in that sense, simply by virtue of being virtual, it begins to reflect and change how we see the real or our realities. And in that sense, rather than kind of having our constants or our fixed factors of architecture being fit into a kind of square peg into a round hole of discipline. What if we actually begin to kind of think about architecture as being changed in its most basic way, or the way that we do it, or in a way that is being done now as well, kind of other influences coming into it, not necessarily making architecture disappear, but just transforming into a different animal. Is that
I would, sorry if I sound now very teacher-like, I would give you an exercise, for tomorrow. Vitruvius gave a definition of architecture. Le Corbusier called it a superb game of, volume under the light. But tomorrow you come with a definition that would encompass our time.
That was funny of you. Just answered my question with a question.
This is totally acceptable.
I feel a lot of sympathy when you said that the computer is, the architecture is a way of knowledge. I guess what's been triggered, from a personal perspective, I don't know if you agree, is that with the computer, the question of knowing what has changed. And then go to Antoine's first comment on that all disciplines, or a lot of disciplines are using the computer, and I wonder if the future of computation for architects is the device to connect to society in a new way, in different ways.
That's what I'm going to say is partly in response to your previous question. I think we have to be careful not to consider the digital a category of itself, something which is holistic, which is a category of its own. It permeates so many fields of our lives that to consider that an architect has his work completely changed because of the digital, I think is a very reductive and possibly naive view. They are, say, on any building I'm going to have to design and build, there are at least 2/3 or 3/4 of the problems which have nothing to do with the technology. So hence, we have to think to which extent the technology does affect some aspect, but that's why I used again this issue of the concept to see which is the concept which has changed. Anyway, I left you, you had a question.
I had more something like, listening to your use of concept, because I'm thinking, if you take the Vitruvian triad, you may also say that they are not classical concepts, they are types of questions. And whether actually what we're looking to is actually one of the new pertinent questions for architecture, which is slightly different than the static concept. And then we already see some of them having a reason, like for example materiality. That so many things revolve around the question of materiality. And so there is perhaps there one possible fundamental question.
I'm glad you bring this up. There is a definition which I will use of architecture. That is, architecture invents concept and materializes them. In other words, it's not only inventing concept. I'll give you some concept: the free plan, the serving and servant spaces, and so on. Or you could even go to more, the concept of the envelope, for example. But the fact that, as opposed to a philosopher, we have to materialize the concept, or to at least to relate to its potential materialization, even if you don't build it. So that's very unusual. Mathematicians don't do that. Computers don't do that. They are only a mechanism. So that relationship between the concept and the materialization is one thing which is characteristic of our, I hesitate to use the word discipline, but our activity. And so that's somewhere that's part of the definition. But the computer is not going to help you with that, because the materialization through the computer is not that different from the way we build cathedrals, several hundred years ago.
I have a more operative question. What was the impact of the early internet on the paperless studio, say in its first several years? The first Netscape browser appeared in 1994, for instance. University campuses tended to give students email between 1990 and 1994 for the first time. I don't know what Columbia did, but other campuses did. What was the impact?
I'm trying to think. I'm not sure. I think the question is very interesting. I mean, I know the impact later, on research, on our everyday life, the access to information. But at that time, it's interesting. I never asked myself the question. I was trying to.
Do you recall when it might have begun to impact, or what in?
My feeling is it is my intuition is that it was later. That it was everything was in terms of the manipulation of a formal language, for example, that was already in place. The manipulation of information came later.
I was very interested in your objective, making a place for a new generation at Columbia when we started. And also your description of how heterogeneous and sometimes conflictual were these researches that were going on at that moment. If you look at that generation now, how would you describe these differences that were so evident in that moment? Do you perceive a different kind of, how can I say, more convergent character in that generation? Or do you still perceive these very strong differences as at that time? And underlying that, perhaps there is something behind that. There is also perhaps the evolution of this generation is also an evolution which is dealing with the problem of building, and how this could have impact this kind of very different starting point.
I'm going to do something I think very risky in introducing the word critical. At the time we were very much competing against one another. that was during the Rally competition. Rem and I had, Rem Koolhaas and I had dinner together, promised each other all open information, you know, about everything which was happening, which of course we never did. But at one moment during that dinner, he said something interesting, which was, Bernard, remember, we are the last critical generation. And later, some people who invented the post-critical indeed lumped together people of my generation and people of Peter's generation, which I've always considered as two different generations. So we were the critical, and now we were in the age of the post-critical. In reality, to my mind, the generation of Greg Lynn, Kipnis, and say Ben Virtual and all that, they also read, right? And when they talk about, you know, the fold, it's not necessarily in the naive manner of folding a building as it's the Deleuzian. No, that was, even if we all understood only half of the argument, that was also an intelligent critical discourse. So the question now is that I would say that the critical discourse did exist, that it was not only a mechanical thing of using a new technology, it was trying to make this technology part of the shift in thinking, call it post-structuralism, etc., that was happening at the time. So now the question would be, another way to formulate it is what is happening today in this sense, right? Where is the discourse? And again, I'm throwing the question back to you for your definition of the one model.
Bernard, it strikes me, I mean, now you're talking and answering and all of this critical issues. You started your presentation saying, okay, I'm going to talk in a way also more personally and kind of autobiography. I show you what was happening before the digital, and it strikes me how much is the mode of representation. We call modes of representation of the avant-garde. I mean, some of the images you presented at the beginning, I say, well, is this now or it was Elisisky? I mean, the way of representing the oblique. So, I mean, what you implicitly are telling me now, maybe I'm wrong, is that we need, I mean, the digital does make the difference. We need a kind of new avant-garde, a new, maybe more critical. I mean, that goes further, the languages, the concept, I mean, like a reformation, I mean.
It's amusing, or it's good you use the word avant-garde. It's clear that in the 70s, those architects who were not terribly keen in the Aldo Rossi or Robert Venturi view of their future were quite fascinated by the early 20th century avant-garde. Not only constructivism, but expressionism, Dada, surrealism, etc. So, and inevitably, when you find yourself as a minority, you look for allies, and these allies were at the beginning of the 20th century. And indeed, if you look at the deconstructivist show in '88 at MoMA, there was indeed a lot of this search for allies somewhere, right? For practically everybody, well, actually for everybody in the show. So, but what was interesting is that a few years later, the whole era of looking for the future of the past, that conversation, that discourse had disappeared. So if you take this current period, now I'm talking about 2010, 2013, then the question becomes relatively uncertain. There is an issue of log where Peter is not, wants to do stock taking. And it's fascinating to read, the various responses of the people who participated in this conversation with Peter or with Tony Vidler, is that there is no clarity in that. So nothing wrong with it. You get it retroactively or retrospectively. But I keep repeating myself. I think we have to raise the question. And for example, you say, it looks like those guys that did. I do think that movement of bodies in space is still as valid a question today as it was, 90 years ago. And so, and that's not part of the conversation, right? There is no conversation today about the city. We have talked about the word architecture. Nobody has talked about the influence of the computer on the city. There used to be plans that there were architects who were doing master plans for the city, Ungers, Rossi, and so on. What has happened with the computer and the city? Nothing. Nowhere.
Hani is meeting somewhere about that.
Sorry?
Hani is meeting somewhere about that.
Sorry?
Hani,
yes. Yeah, it's fine.
And there must be others.
Yeah, but if I look, because the city, architects are very influenced by other architects. That's how it has always worked. And hence, certain devices or certain techniques, I hate the word composition still now, but I'll still use the word composition of techniques, are borrowed from one architecture to another and all that. What is interesting is at the moment I see very little new thinking that has an effect on the way cities are being conceived and designed at a time when one has never built so many new cities. And so the conversation becomes enormously, or definitely more complex when you start to bring a number of different factors. That's why I talk again about the idea of problem. I talk again about the idea of movement, because those are not necessarily in the digital conversation when they are absolutely fundamental to the way we urbanize the individual and to live.
Sorry, it's not an answer, but I think about the relationship between architecture and architect and the city, something has happened, which has in fact a critique of the last 50 years of, especially in France, of social housing, and that the critique against architects who try to deal with social problems and finally we are not really convincing. And maybe now there is, as a consequence, a lack of confidence for the architects to be able to transform this reality with, as you said, with something that has to be built, and in fact it's already built, and you just have to transform. So
yeah, let me give you an example, because I'm not sure. If you talk about the Smithson and Team 10, so you're right. But if you talk about Shadrach Woods and the Free University in Berlin, you're not right. So, but these were models that were at least investigated, even built. What is the equivalent in the digital age?
May have to do with something, and if you look at what's happening with smart cities today, it's deeply non-spatial. It's about, well, it has a spatial impact, but it's mostly about, putting captors, getting information, etc. There is a kind of divorce between the way the city is, digital, is becoming digital, and the way architecture evolves.
Yeah, but then I'll ask you again,
Not to say that it's
using
not a
this,
problem.
is this the equivalent of public space?
Well, that's at least the way a lot of people approach now the question of public space.
Yeah,
No, not to say that it's not a problem, but
I think we are on the same page.
But Antoine, there are a lot of studies now that are starting to move from inequalities in political, social understanding to space inequalities. It is the new kind of issues that are coming out very strongly, and that space inequalities is something that clearly has nothing to do with smart cities.
I agree, but I think it's a very paradoxical moment in which both have the so-called spatial authority. At the same time, a spatialization of digital tools, but the way we think about the relation between the city and the digital is very often not classically spatial.
But perhaps it implies that there is an ideological statement behind the use of digital tools today in defining certain kind of problems instead of other tools.
Absolutely.
So
I don't want to deny that. We're just
stating
stating the extent of the problem, which is also, a lot of people are talking about ubiquitous, ambient computing, etc., and which is the idea that built objects are not the problem.
And still they are.
And still, yeah, no, I agree.
We have
10 minutes.
10 minutes, yeah. Give our...
Do you think that architecture might be on the verge of extinction? This is what Andrea Brand recently said. I think architecture is on the way out because the build is important, but is the build architecture when the digital equipment that I have in my pocket can transform this room in a theater or in a techno club in 30 minutes or is it something else? Well, function would be provided by other means.
Yeah.
But as it's very dark, it's like architecture is on the way out, well, I'm a designer, so I might be safe.
Okay, since I have an enormous admiration for Ramsey and some of his work, and one particular piece of work, No Stop City, it's not an inconsequential sort of influence on me, I would say the following, is that I'll use the example of No Stop City. No Stop City, as they say at the time, is a critical project not meant to be realized, but simply to verify where the system is going, where the system is heading. So it's a dark statement. At the same time, it's an unbelievably beautiful and inventive piece of work. It has all sorts of ramifications that you can read into it. And that's why I tend to think that architecture is far from being on its way to be instinct, but potentially be even more potent or present than it has ever been, if only architects would recognize it. And the problem, I come back to that, all of us, because I put myself a little bit in this category, we are designing, icons that can be onto this. In other words, individual objects that some of them are remarkable, but they do not contribute to everyday life. I'll give an example that you are all aware of, because it has happened in a lot of cities before that. But when in 10 years ago, when you would go to Beijing, you still had some neighborhoods where there was public space. There was the Vuitton in the street and a certain social organization. That social organization has been completely, bulldozed, replaced by 8 lanes or 24 lanes, highways, and the same 25 stories housing blocks. So no more public space, everybody's, and so the question, it's like to bring your points about post-war housing. Sure, there was an incredible need for reconstruction immediately after the war. There may have been an incredible need in certain part of the world for urbanization in order to accelerate progress or whatever consumption. I tend to think that architects, probably because of the fact that they are the few people who never have, whenever we start a new project, we don't know what we're talking about. We literally invent as we go along, try to give sense, try to give coherence. It's possibly, and I come back to my plea to see whether that new digital age allows for new mode of thoughts. And at the moment, I would hate it to become simply a device, or I use a literary analogy, like the Nouveau Roman was a fantastic, thing about literature in the 60s, and then it fizzled out, and that's it. So if the computer is only a facilitator and not the concept, then we're nowhere.
Right, one more, last one.
Oh, I can't take no back.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, well, maybe it leads you back to the question that you gave us, what is architecture? And it goes to this question of what digital cultures are enabling in this way of thinking. So my question is, I'm leaving it sort of vague and conceptual. It's like, what dimensions do you think are available to narrative today? Dimensions in this very broad sense.
You have to tell me why you use the word narrative.
I was intentionally trying to leave it vague for you to define narrative.
Yeah, the reason why I ask the question is that the discussion around the notion of narrative has happened at different periods in history and has had very different meanings. Some saw it literally telling a story, they didn't tell a story. Some saw it as more as in a filmic sense, right? Sequences. So I'm not too sure how, and some people in literary theory have tried to discredit the narrative. So in architecture today, it means so many things that you have to give me the definition before I can, do, something.
A lot of homework to do for tomorrow. Designing architecture, defining narrative.
Thank you.